I used to think the Atlantic only took what you offered it, that the ocean's hunger could be bargained with. If you met it, halfway waded out to the knees, and let the tide kiss your shins and tug your hem. But the morning my son told me, I wouldn't be needing my house anymore. The sea taught me something different. Salt spray stung like needles, or perhaps frost was forming in my veins as I stood on the wraparound porch and watched my boy, my Liam, dangle the keys I had polished with 1,000 small, ordinary acts of love and hand them to his wife's father with the casual indifference of a man announcing the weather. The cedar siding was bleached pale as old bone. The roses Arthur planted for our 10th anniversary clung to the trellis against the wind, and every memory I had stitched into those boards seemed to tilt and judder loose. Isabel stood beside my son in a cashmere sweater that whispered wealth when she crossed her arms, and her mouth held a triumphant smirk that didn't even wobble as her parents marched up the steps like proprietors from a glossy magazine spread. Their black Mercedes shone obscenely in the gray light. They'd already labeled my life as theirs, luggage monogrammed voices, brisk bodies, practiced in the choreography of acquisition. I thought I might scream or plead, or throw myself across the threshold like a storm door in a gale, but a strange calm came over me, the kind of stillness that follows the crack of lightning. I smiled a small, tight curve that never touched my eyes. "All right," I said, in a voice so thin it might have been paper. They didn't hear the tectonic plates shift under that single syllable. They didn't see the Arctic fire kindle behind my gaze. They should have. They should have noticed how quiet I became. I turned, clutching my old leather handbag, as if the strap could tether me to the earth, and I left them to their laughter and their plans and their ignorance. I drove toward Boston, with my knuckles white on the wheel, not trembling with sorrow, but carrying a fury so cold and clean it could have frozen the harbor and made a road to the moon. Arthur died 2 years earlier, a gentle exit from a brutal battle that had gnawed at his strength, but not his spirit. We were not wealthy people. We were the sort who saved receipts in envelopes by month, who patched the elbows of sweaters and called it mending rather than frugality, who built a house with blistered hands and learned along the way. The Seabrook Point house was our masterpiece. It wasn't grand by coastal standards, but to us it was cathedral and cradle and covenant. We set sea glass in the kitchen backsplash, each tile a memory of a walk together, pockets clinking with green and blue. We planted roses that bled our knuckles and later softened our summers with a fragrance so sweet it felt like forgiveness. When Liam lost his job at the tech firm and slid home shadowed by a shame that wouldn't look me in the eye, I opened the door wider. I gave him and Isabel the guest wing with the ocean view. I cooked their meals, laundered their clothes, and rocked their colicky baby at 3 a.m. while the moon stared in at my sacrifice. I called it love. They called it convenience. The change didn't thunder. It seeped. After the funeral, when casseroles still lined the counter and sympathy cards were thick with script that tried to make sense of the senseless, Isabel began to angle her voice into something bright and persuasive. "A Boston condo would be good for you, Eleanor," she chirped. "More to do for a woman of your age." Liam parroted it later, eyes skittering away from mine. "It's a big burden, Mom. The house, the land." I laughed an actual laugh because the audacity sparkled like broken glass catching the sun. But the laughter stopped the midnight I heard them at the kitchen table whispering over the soft shush of the dishwasher. Isabel's hiss carried "she'll never agree. She's too attached to that old relic." And Liam, my son, answering with the blade of his new voice, "She will. We just have to be strategic. Keep telling her she can't manage it alone. Make her feel like she's in the way. Eventually, she'll break. There are tears that cleanse and tears that carve. Those carved me. Yet I didn't confront them. Because Arthur, my forward-thinking, quietly brilliant husband, had put a net under my high wire. Months before he died after one of those doctor visits, when the phrases grow euphemistic and the air smells like endings, he took my hand and led me to our lawyer's office in the city. In a room of polished wood and soft lamps, we placed the house into an irrevocable trust. Not just in my name, but girded in legal steel that could not be transferred or sold or gifted without my notarized witnessed consent. To protect you, Ellie, he whispered, his palm warm even then. From anything and everything. We didn't tell Liam. We didn't tell anyone. We tucked that paper fortress into the world and resumed our days. Grief can make you forget where you hid the key to your survival, but it returns when you need it. So I let them redecorate. I let them repaint my sea green living room a chic, empty gray. I let them uproot the roses and declare them dated. I let them post a glittering video tour with a caption that used the word blessed like a charm against accountability. I watched them mistake my silence for surrender. From my tiny rented apartment with a view of a brick wall and an alley cat with one good ear, I brewed Earl Grey and called the lawyer. It's time, I said, and the words felt like the first true meal after a famine. The machinery of consequence once woken can be beautiful and terrifying like a well-oiled guillotine. A cease and desist, a formal eviction, a lawsuit for unlawful occupation and damages. Within 48 hours, neatly bound envelopes had their names on them. I drove back to Seabrook Point at dawn and parked behind windswept pines that remembered better men. I watched the paralegal young sleek briefcase like a blade walk the gravel to my front steps. I watched Liam's frown curdle into panic. Isabel's mask cracked into pure rage. Her parents looked like ghosts who suddenly believed in the living. That was my cue. Heels steady spine taller than the roofline, I walked up the drive and stopped at the bottom step. You didn't really think I would just give it all away, did you? My voice was not loud, but it traveled. Their eyes skittered from the papers to my face and back, like minnows trying to flee a net. Mom, please. Liam, stammered hands, lifted in the universal gesture of a man trying to conjure back the door that shut in his face. There's been a misunderstanding. No, I said, and it was a gravestone laid over a grave. You gave what was never yours to give. Isabel lunged forward with indignation polished by years of getting her way. We invested here, she snapped. Paint furniture? I lifted a hand. Your decorating choices are not a deed. The paralegal's timing was theater perfect as he handed the documents across. Isabel's father swore so fiercely the air went blue. I stood like granite and remembered the weight of Arthur's casket and the quiet of the earth closing over a man who would not have recognized the sun. They slammed the door, and I smiled at the oak as if it were an old friend. The rest would be process and patience. For 3 days, I didn't go near the place. I slept on Bee's lumpy but loving couch in Boston and let her laugh brassy bright jar something unbroken in me. Bee had been my roommate, the flame to my steady wick. I told you that girl was a viper, she declared over chamomile, the cup clattering into its saucer with happy ferocity. And your boy. Lord Eleanor, if I had a better arm, I'd throw sense at his head until it stuck. I smiled, then genuinely, but grief hummed low and constant under my ribs. You sure you want to carry this to the bitter end? She asked softer. Not bitter, I said. Just true. I returned the following weekend with my lawyer and a locksmith built like a benevolent wall. Court order in hand, the locksmith drilled the lock Isabel had smugly installed. The hum of his cheerful off-key tune, ridiculous in that lemon-yellow living room, is a sound I will treasure for the rest of my life. They clustered, puffed up and furious. The lawyer's voice was calm and edged. Interfere, and you'll be arrested for contempt. The bluster evaporated. And then I saw the mantel. Bare. The photograph of my husband on our wedding day, the one that had kept vigil above the hearth, was gone. Where is my husband's picture? I asked Isabel, and my voice was glacier smooth. It didn't match the new color scheme, she said, eyes flicking toward the basement door. I descended those old steps and found Arthur leaning against concrete next to a box of orphaned Christmas ornaments. I lifted him and carried him upstairs. I looked at my lawyer. 7 days, I said. Not 30. I wanted them out with nothing of mine in their hands but the memory of how it felt to be held to account. The week that followed tasted like victory and salt. I sat in my sedan down the road and watched moving trucks heave and groan. Isabel's parents scowled when they caught sight of me. Liam kept his eyes glued to the ground, as if he'd find a better version of himself in the gravel. On the 7th day, I stepped into a house that smelled faintly of bleach and the ghosts of lemon paint. It was empty. It was mine. The rose garden was a churned-up wound, but the bones of the place beam's windows, floorboards that creaked in the middle of the night, the way Arthur used to on his way to the fridge, had kept faith. I placed Arthur's photograph back above the mantel and whispered, "We're home." The knock at the door came soft and unsure. My son stood there holding a damp cardboard box, like it contained a bird he dared not look at. I saved some clippings, he said, not meeting my eyes, from the roses. Inside were thorny stems tucked in cold soil. "They're not blooming," I said. "They will," he answered quickly, hope leaking through the crack in his voice. I made tea because that is what I know how to do with pain. He sat at the breakfast table and wrapped his hands around the mug like sinners hold candles. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words hung there like soap bubbles that could pop without changing anything. "Are you?" I asked. He stumbled, grasping for defense. "I didn't know about the trust. I never would have. I didn't mean—" "You didn't ask?" I said. "You decided for me." I reminded him of the basement of Arthur's face leaned against damp concrete, like a memory unworthy of air. He flushed and tried to explain himself into absolution. "I thought you were strong," he said at last, as if it were a kindness. "You didn't think I was strong," I told him. "You thought I was weak enough to be managed." Then he said the thing that made my fury pause. "They kicked me out," he whispered. "Isabel and her parents. Last night." The irony tasted metallic. He had handed them my keys, and they had used him as a tool until he dulled, then tossed him into the junk drawer. "You come here for sympathy?" I asked, and he shook his head, once a small boy movement in a grown man's body. "I came here because it's the only place that's ever felt like home." I didn't forgive him because he looked hurt. I didn't absolve him because it would ease the ache. I told him to put the shed key on the table and leave for now. "Let me breathe," I said. He looked as if I'd sliced him cleanly in two, but he nodded and went. That night, I called B. She didn't ask for details. She already knew the shapes. "Did the prodigal cry?" she asked. "Almost," I said. She snorted, delighted. "Progress." Then she got serious. "What now, Ellie? Do you believe people can change?" I stared out at the churned earth where my roses had been, and thought of Arthur winding the grandfather clock every Sunday, saying, "We keep time, or it keeps us." "He always said you judge a man by how he gets up," I told her. "So I'll watch him get up." In the morning, I sent a single text. "Be here at 7 a.m. Bring work gloves." At 6, his old sedan coughed up the drive, and he stepped out in jeans with frayed knees and a hoodie that had seen better days. He looked tired. He looked present. I handed him coffee on the porch and nodded toward the scarred garden. That section was your father's, I said. Yellow. This side was mine. White climbers. Let's start with the soil. We turned earth in silence. We mixed compost and laid soaker hose and set the thorny clippings like faith in a ground that had been wounded but not ruined. He listened. He learned. He asked where to place his hands and for once waited for the answer. At noon, we stood back and looked at a ghost of a garden spindly and uncertain. They don't look like much, he said. Neither did you when you were born, I replied, and his mouth twitched into something that might one day be a smile. For weeks, this was our ritual. He arrived at 7 sharp. We rebuilt the beds and resealed the porch swing. We stripped the gray and painted the kitchen a sea green that caught the morning light like a promise. He did not complain. He did not ask to be absolved. He showed up. Even B, who has never been stingy with skepticism, came, by one evening, looked at the neat rows of new life, looked at my son with a tilt of her head, and said to me, "Probation over. Ask me again when the roses bloom," I told her, and she nodded as if a contract had been signed. They bloomed on a morning after rain when the world smelled washed. I stepped onto the porch expecting the same patient green and stopped. The garden was lit from within yellow cups opening, like small suns, white climbers spilling down their trellis like spilled milk in heaven. A stray pink flared from a stubborn root we had thought gone. I felt something in me unclench the long-held anger loosening its teeth. Liam was already there on his knees in the dirt eyes, wet with a wonder I remembered from his childhood when he'd found a sand-dollar hole on the shore. They opened, he whispered. They forgave. We watered, I said, and then I knelt beside him because it felt right to meet this moment, not above him, but beside him. The sleek, black car slithered into the drive like a bad thought. Isabel stepped out, sunglasses masking her eyes, her posture sharp enough to cut. Liam, she called, voice cool and proprietary. Your parents are worried sick. They're your parents, he said, standing and wiping his hands on his jeans. And they threw me out. You let them. She took a step closer, nostrils flared at the smell of humility. You embarrassed them, she snapped. Dragging lawyers into a private family matter? He looked at me, then at the garden, then at her. I was thinking about the woman who raised me, he said, voice steady. The one I betrayed because you told me to. He drew breath and let it out slowly. We're married, Isabel, but I don't think we should be. I want a partner, not a warden. She turned her glare on me. Is this because of her I didn't poison him? I said softly. I just watered him after you left him for dead. For once, she had no comeback. She spun, got in her car, and was gone with a spray of gravel that couldn't touch us. That evening, as the sky bruised purple at the edges, Liam handed me a folded paper. I opened it, and there it was, our deed, Arthur's signature, a familiar flourish mine beside it, the corners worn by years and meaning. I wanted you to have it, he said. Where it belongs. I traced the ink the way I used to trace the line of Arthur's jaw when he slept. I trust you. I whispered, surprising myself with the truth of it. I don't deserve that yet, he said, and I nodded. Maybe not, but you're earning it. We sat on the porch swing, the house behind us steady as ever, the garden breathing perfume into the evening. And for the first time since I'd watched a stranger dangle keys to my life in front of people who thought themselves owners, I felt anchored. Not by bricks or deeds or even roses, but by the sense that something broken might be mended if one person chose repair and another allowed it. Type continued to receive the next part. I could say the weeks that followed were easy because the worst had passed, but that would be a lie we tell children to help them sleep. Work is work. whether it's soil or trust, or old floorboards that need coaxing back into strength. Each morning, I found him at the edge of the garden, crouched low, as if consulting with the roses. He'd learned to bring a notebook, not the sleek kind from his old life, but a composition book, like he'd carried in grade school pages, now smudged with dirt and notes, in a handwriting that had grown steadier with repetitions of humility. He'd write down what I told him, how to prune in a slant to shed rain, how to watch for aphids and wash them away rather than drown them in poisons, how to listen when the leaves whispered that the roots were thirsty. In the afternoons, we turned our hands to the house, to the scuffed stairs, and the sunroom floor that had lost its shine. We found old jars in the pantry, mason glass full of screws Arthur had saved, because you always need one more. We replaced the sagging screen door that the sea wind had bullied for a decade, and rehung it so it didn't sigh every time it closed, but clicked like punctuation at the end of a sentence that meant what it said. Sometimes we spoke of nothing but the job we were doing. Sometimes he told me stories I had missed from the years he was away. How the office microwaves were always a battleground. How his boss collected watches and never looked anyone in the eye for longer than a second. Once he started to say something about the moment he'd lost his job, and the pitch of his voice changed, breaking on the word redundant, and I put my hand up and said, "You don't have to bleed every truth in one day." He nodded, and we let the silence stitch him quietly. The town came to know our new rhythm. Mrs. Potter from 3 houses down, who'd always had a flair for seeing everything without ever leaving her garden chair, ambled over to declare that the yellow we chose for the Adirondack chairs was the color of good butter, and I chose to take that as benediction. The mailman began leaving seed catalogs tucked inside the community bulletin, smiling tight when he looked from me to Liam as if afraid any sudden kindness might startle the fragile thing we were cultivating. Bee came and went like weather, sometimes bright, sometimes thunder. She took photos of me laughing when the hose slipped and soaked my jeans, and I scolded her half-heartedly for threatening my dignity. "Dignity is overrated," she said. "You're overrated," I shot back, which made her throw her head back and bray, and even the crows paused to stare at the spectacle. We were making a new life, from true things, labor apology, patience. Of course, the old life kept knocking. Isabel texted him in the first week with paragraphs sharpened into weapons. He didn't show me, but I saw the tension in his jaw as he typed replies and then erased them again and again. Finally, I said, "You can sit in my kitchen and let your thumb ache from backspacing, or you can put your phone in the drawer and help me strip this banister." He put the phone in the drawer. The next day, a letter arrived from her parents' lawyer, more bluster than bite, demanding restitution for improvements. My lawyer answered with a line so clean it should be carved into stone. "Your clients cannot be compensated for a trespass they initiated and prolonged after notice." When I read that, something unclenched further in me, not because I needed to see them scolded, but because words used properly can feel like ironwork that holds up a roof. I realized how long I had been bent under the weight of wrong words wielded carelessly. At night, when the house settled and the clock ticked, the way a faithful thing ticks, I would hold the deed and run my fingers over our names. I remembered signing it with Arthur in that little county office, how we joked about the stiffness of the clerk and the squeak of her chair, and then how I'd caught his hand elbow deep in the candy bowl on the way out. "We paid for it," he'd said, wicked glint in his eye, and I had laughed so hard I doubled over. We'd gotten ice cream on the way home in mid-October, huddled with napkins to catch the drips as if we were teenagers with nothing but summer in our pockets. Memory is tricky like that. It can pierce you and stitch you in the same breath. Liam began to ask different questions, the small, honest kind that reveal a person changing. "What did you want for your life before, Dad?" he asked one morning when we were adjusting the trellis. I took my time answering because truth needs room. A studio above a bakery, I said. I wanted to paint bowls of pears and the backs of people's hands. He blinked, then smiled, as if he could see it, the bowls, the hands. You could still do that, he offered too quickly, and I shook my head, not to say no, but to say slow. These were not losses to be erased by suggestion. They were rooms to be added at the right time. We found Arthur everywhere. In the pencil marks on the basement doorframe where he'd measured Liam's height. In the way the back door stuck when the fog rolled in and you had to lift it just so to get the latch to catch. In a notebook forgotten in the tool chest, a list of small chores he'd meant to do, all neat blocks, with checkboxes waiting patient as dogs by the door. We began checking them off one by one. It felt like having a conversation with a man who kept a precise court in the details. Sometimes I caught Liam watching me as I touched the things Arthur touched, and I knew he was taking in the weight of what he had almost given away. Shame is a heavy coat. If you make a man wear it in the heat, he'll collapse. If you hang it on a peg by the door and let him put it on when he needs to remember, he'll carry it the way a sailor carries a knife, useful sobering part of the kit. On the third Saturday after the roses opened, a storm blew in that made the house hum with old ocean songs. The windows were newly sealed thanks to our work, and the hiss was less a draft than a reminder. I made chowder because that was what we did in big weather. Bee came without asking a bottle of wine under her arm, even though soup and wine have never loved each other. We ate at the kitchen table we'd rescued from a thrift store the year we married the gouges in the wood polished by use into something like character. "You going to divorce her, Bee?" asked Blunt as a hammer. Liam swallowed, looked into his bowl and answered a different question first. "I was scared all the time," he said. "Not because she yelled. She didn't need to. It was the way the room felt when I disagreed. Like the air got tight." He put his spoon down. "Yes," he said at last. "I'm going to ask for a divorce." I didn't applaud. I didn't cry. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. "Then do it cleanly," I said. "No revenge, no mud, just truth." Bee raised her glass in a toast. "To truth," she said, and we clinked rim to rim, survivors of a shipwreck who had found the same shore at last. The divorce moved faster than I expected, as if even the court sensed something had been forced that refused to hold. Isabel fought on paper and in text messages and with a grace on social media that made strangers send her hearts. It is one of the evils of our age that suffering wears filters well. But when the first hearing came and she had to speak without a camera smoothing her edges, she faltered. The judge was kind and crisp. He asked questions that did what good questions do. They stripped the story down to lumber and nails and asked whether the structure could bear weight. It couldn't. Liam spoke quietly, but with the steadiness of someone who has finally learned that statement is not attack. I watched my son tell the truth, and though I did not forgive the past in that moment, I believed more deeply in his future. On the drive home, we didn't put on the radio. We let the miles simplify us. When we pulled into the drive, the evening was pearl gray, the kind of light that makes every surface look honest. The roses were resting petals loose with yesterday's beauty. He turned off the engine and didn't move. "I don't know how to be a good man," he said without drama. "I only know I don't want to be the man I was." "That's a start," I said. "Good men don't declare themselves. They behave themselves into it." He nodded. In the porch light, he looked like both his father and himself. People in town began to shift around us. The hardware store guy called me Mrs. Evans again, not Eleanor, which I took as an apology dressed as formality. The pastor from the little church on the hill dropped by one afternoon with a pie and a book of poems. I've learned not to bring Bible verses to a woman who can spot platitudes at 40 paces, he said, and I laughed harder than the line deserved, grateful for a man who had learned his lessons somewhere beyond my front stoop. Even the crows softened enough to leave their shiny bits on the fence posts. Gifts, maybe, or proof of life. One morning, I found a package by the door with no return address. Inside were the missing porcelain vases from my living room, wrapped in layers of newspaper and apology. The paper smelled like a house that had never learned to cook. There was a note with a single line. I'm sorry about the basement. I didn't recognize the handwriting, and I didn't need to. I placed the vases back on the mantel beneath Arthur's laughing face. We contain multitudes, I told him, even the ones who hurt us, and then I dusted the shelf as if that might help the world see clearly. The day we chose to rehang the porch swing properly, new chains, fresh lag bolts sunk deep into sound joists, Liam climbed the ladder while I stood below bracing. He measured twice, drilled once, checked level, like a monk working to hold the world straight with a bubble and a line. When he was done, he hopped down with a boy's grin. Try it, he said, and I sat. The swing moved with a silken confidence it hadn't had since the last time Arthur had done the same repair. I closed my eyes and let the air brush my cheeks. You did that well, I said, and the sentence did a thing I didn't expect. It filled him. Sometimes the simplest true praise is the antidote to years of hollow compliments. He didn't preen. He didn't make a joke. He nodded. Thank you, he said. Type continued to receive the next part. The summertime tide changed color as if the ocean had decided to forgive winter for its meanness. By then, our lives had settled into a tempo that honored both history and hope. We bought new cushions for the porch chairs, not extravagant ones, just firm and blue and built to last. We fixed the buzzy hum in the kitchen light that had driven me mad for years, but that Arthur had sworn he would tend to next weekend, and we laughed when we finished, because the job took 6 minutes and 35 years. The roses got fat with bloom. People came by, and we handed them clippers and sent them home with paper-wrapped bundles like edible bouquets for the heart. I watched neighbors I'd only ever waved to sit in my new old kitchen and tell me bits of their lives they'd been saving, as if the house, having survived attempted erasure, had become a safe in which to set modest treasures. One afternoon, I walked in on Liam standing in the living room staring at Arthur's photograph. His face was complicated regret braided with gratitude and something like awe. I kept thinking you were strong, he said, not looking away from his father. But what I meant was, I figured you would absorb whatever I handed you. That isn't strength. That's me expecting to ask too much. He turned to me. I didn't actually know you. I knew the version of the mother who never said no. He swallowed. I'm trying to know you now. Tenderness bloomed behind my ribs, in a place that I had thought winter killed. We'll learn each other like a new language, I said. We'll mispronounce sometimes. We'll ask for the meaning of words. He nodded, and we went out to deadhead the roses, each snip a small prayer for rebloom. The divorce finalized as cleanly as such things can. There were no children to arrange custody for beyond the ghost of the life they had made together, and that ghost was easier to divide. Isabel returned what she had that was mine. She kept what had been theirs. We did not gloat when the settlement came back sensible. We sat on the porch and watched the light shift month by month and wondered what it might mean to live without the expectation of the next blow. Some nights, I woke to the roar of the ocean and felt my heart gallop like a horse startled by a distant gunshot. But the fear passed sooner and left less noise behind. B drew me one afternoon charcoal on thick paper lines, confident and unflinching. Her hands move like forgiveness when she works rough and generous. She caught the bend of my mouth and the set of my shoulders and the line of my hands, which have always looked older than my face. She wrote a single word at the bottom margin, returned. I framed it and hung it in the hall. When I pass it, I nod at the truth in it. The house kept revealing itself. We found a loose floorboard near the old record player and discovered the stash of love letters Arthur had written me in the first summer of our marriage notes, scribbled on napkins and receipts, and one on the back of a theater program. His voice in those letters is different from the voice I lived beside for 50 years. Lighter, cockier, a little sharp at the corners with youth. I read them like a woman learning there was a room in her house she'd never opened. Liam found me one afternoon laughing at a line so extravagant it would embarrass a poet, and he said, "He really adored you." "He did," I said, and then added, "because truth demands its companion truth, and he annoyed me sometimes the way only a person you love completely can." We sat on the floor and let the letters surround us. He picked one up with a smile that looked like the boy who used to sprawl on this rug, watching cartoons, while Arthur snored in his chair on Sunday afternoons. I wondered if healing is sometimes nothing more than letting the past share the couch with the present, without the two starting a fight. News of our boundary triumph traveled farther than I wanted. A local columnist called to ask if she could tell the story of the widow who took her house back. I declined. I have no interest in becoming anyone's metaphor. But I told the truth to a woman at the grocery who whispered, "I'm living something like it," and then cried in the freezer aisle beside the peas. I held her hand until she could breathe again and told her the single sentence that kept me from falling through the floor of my self-paper can hold what people drop. She nodded as if I'd handed her a tool. Maybe I had. On a Wednesday, the locksmith returned to install a proper deadbolt, and I laughed to see him again, the same cheerful tune under his breath. "You all right?" he asked when he'd finished, and I said, "Better than all right," which startled us both. The paralegal sent a holiday card with a photograph of him with a dog so small it looked like a wind-up toy. My lawyer's bill arrived, and I paid it gladly, every digit a small song. Justice costs. I do not begrudge the price. Then there was the morning Isabel's mother came to the house alone. I saw her through the window standing on the porch with her clutch held like shame just under her ribs. I opened the door and stepped out. "I can't come in," she said. "All right." We stood. The sea breathed somewhere beyond the pines. She looked smaller than I remembered, as if certainty had been a scaffold, and someone had rolled it away. "I raised her to marry well," she said finally, voice thin. "I thought that was protection." She swallowed. "I'm sorry for the things I said with my face." It was an odd apology, and somehow the truest kind, because she had never lowered herself to words. "I accept," I said. She nodded once sharply, as if we'd completed a transaction, and left. I closed the door and leaned my head against the wood, not with relief, but with a gentleness I didn't expect to feel for a woman who had tried to make me a footnote. Women learn, or we don't, and sometimes the difference arrives late. Summer gave way to early fall, and the garden entered its second bloom with a glory that looked less like youth and more like grace. The yellows deepened, the whites softened, the pinks showed their stubborn throats. I began to paint in the mornings at the kitchen table, bowls and hands, yes pears and peonies, and once the corner of Arthur's jacket from a photograph where he's turning toward me with a half smile that says, "The punchline is in his mouth, and he's about to give it." I painted the roses the way they looked at dusk, when the light makes edges uncertain, and everything you thought you knew proves itself kinder. When I finished a small, still life, I wasn't ashamed if I showed it to Liam. He didn't gush or hedge. "It looks like us," he said, which made no literal sense, and all the sense there is. We refurnished, slowly buying nothing we couldn't carry up the steps ourselves. There is a satisfaction in lifting what you own that I had forgotten. One evening, we ate dinner on the floor because the new-to-us dining table hadn't yet been delivered, and we told stories with our plates in our laps. I told him about the time his father burned the fish beyond recognition and then invented a sauce to save it, and how we'd called it Arthur's Cloud and pretended it was French. He told me about the time he almost called and didn't, and how that not calling felt in his throat for months afterward. Why I asked not to accuse, but to understand. Because I was proud, he said, and then quietly the only way a truly honest thing can be spoken and ashamed. I reached out and touched his wrist. Both are houses, I said. Pick the one with a door. He nodded. I'm trying. When the leaves began to drop their tired beauties and the air went sharp in the mornings, the roses took their last turn and then rested. We tucked them in with mulch, the way you tuck a child in with a blanket you've washed, until it is more memory than fiber. On the final day before first frost, we clipped one bloom from each bush and set them in jars along the mantel, a little army of color to hold the winter back. We stood together and looked at them silent in the hush that comes when you have run a good race for a season and are ready to sit down. I realized I had forgiven my son not in some cinematic swell, but in the quiet repetition of the days. Forgiveness had been a verb disguised as a week, then a month, then a summer. It had been soil under my nails and coffee in 2 mugs at dawn. It had been the willingness to let him show me change, not as a promise, but as a habit. I did not tell him. I let him feel it the way one feels warmth when the sun finds your face after a long shade. Type, continue to receive the next part. When winter came, it came honest and clean the way it does on the coast, when the wind removes pretense from the air. The house proved its bones again. We had caulked and sealed and rewired and rehung with our own hands, and now the work paid us back in warmth and in the absence of drafts that once muttered all night like bad ideas. I learned how the light fell in December, thin and precise, and chased it with my sketchbook around the kitchen, catching the exact moment a spoon cast a shadow like a sundial's quiver. Liam shoveled the steps, though I told him the storm would melt by noon. Let me do it while I can, he said, and I heard what he meant. Let me contribute. Let me be useful. Let me shoulder a weight I once made you shoulder alone. He found a job at a small boatyard down the road, the kind of work a man can sleep after. He came home smelling of varnish and salt, and there was a steady pleasure in watching him carry the day on his shoulders without it sagging him. The first holiday arrived with its usual trapdoors and its easy joys. We did not pretend we weren't tender. We didn't set extra places for ghosts, but we spoke their names out loud, Arthur, and the version of Liam, who had lost himself, and the mother I had been in the months I allowed myself to be erased. B came with her new girlfriend, a woman who asked excellent questions, and listened all the way to the end of the answer before speaking. We ate too much pie, and then ate a little more. After the dishes, Liam took out a box he had retrieved from the storage in the shed, the good ornaments, the ones we had packed the year before, when everything still bore the shape of grief. We trimmed the tree we had cut from the lot that sells only the right height for each room and a joke with every saw. We hung the battered paper star he had made in 2nd grade next to the glass one Arthur and I had bought in a city at Christmas long ago, and somehow the juxtaposition didn't look absurd. It looked like a thesis about love's enduring appetite for both the humble and the bright. Occasionally, the past knocked not to be invited in, but to remind us it knew the address. A friend of Isabel's posted a clipping from a design magazine featuring a house that looked eerily like mine, except bigger and colder and without a single object in it that could break without a decorator weeping. The caption read, "Minimalist Coastal Dream." I laughed out loud and texted the photo to B, who replied, "Maximalist emotional reality is better." We did not speak of Isabel much. When she appeared in town, which was rare, she avoided our street, and I could not tell whether it was pride or prudence. I felt no urge to teach her anything. Life would do that with an efficiency I could never match. And then there came a day in late February when the air tricked us into thinking spring had decided to arrive early, the kind of day that makes everyone in New England take off their coat too soon. I was pruning the hydrangea and thinking about lemon bars when a car pulled up an ordinary sedan carrying ordinary tiredness. A woman stepped out whom I did not recognize until I noticed the set of her mouth. Isabel. Without her armor, she simply looked like a person rendered fallible by breath. She stood at the edge of the walk and said my name, not a question, not a demand, just a placing of sound into air. I walked to the porch railing. I came to say, "I'm sorry," she said, "for hurting you." The silence between what she had done and the size of those 6 words yawned dangerous. She went on halting as if the words cost. I thought power meant never having to be afraid. I made you small so I could feel big. She inhaled and then let it out. I was wrong. I did not rush to close the space with words because apologies are seeds and need time to find soil. "Thank you," I said at last. She nodded. "I don't expect anything," she added quickly as if reading my mind. "I just wanted to say it." She turned to go, then turned back. "He seems, well, he is," I said. She smiled thin and real and left. I stood a long time letting the incident be exactly what it was, no more, no less a bookmark in a chapter that had contained too many authors. Spring came on for real with the noisy fanfare it loves peepers at night, early mornings dripping with birdsong, the sun climbing the stairs of the day, with the confidence of a good man who has stopped announcing himself and simply shows up with tools. The roses woke and stretched and decided to trust us again. We added a little white fence, not the cutesy kind, but a sturdy line that marked where things began and where they didn't. Boundaries are beautiful. B declared, leaning against a post and sipping lemonade like a debutante who'd taken a wrong turn and found a better party. Liam started building a small bench for the far corner of the yard, a simple thing with honest angles. He showed me his sketch. "It's good," I said then, pointed. "This brace needs to be longer." He grinned and revised without a sulk. I love a man who can take instruction without taking it as an insult. One evening, we had dinner on the porch. The sky went from blue to the color of a bruise, and then to that luminous indigo that looks like someone whispered light into the darkness, and it listened. "I've been thinking," Liam said, then paused. "Always dangerous?" I teased, and he rolled his eyes, old style an echo of teenage sarcasm that made us both laugh. "I want to buy a little plot down the road," he said, serious again. "Land is cheaper than it should be because the view isn't perfect. I want to build something modest with my own hands. Not soon. Not before I've paid what I owe here in sweat and presence. But one day, my heart did 2 contradictory things. It lifted because this is what you want for your child the desire to make, and it clenched because the making of his own might mean the leaving of mine." "That sounds right," I said. "When you do, I'll help you carry the first board." He smiled that smile that looks like gratitude with its shoes off. "You already have," he said. We sat and listened to the sea, which had nothing to add and everything to support. The first roses opened on the anniversary of Arthur's death. I hadn't planned it that way. The garden simply kept its own counsel. I woke, made coffee, and went out to find yellow cups and white fists unfurling as if following a script no human had written. I felt Arthur there, not like a ghost, but like a pressure change, a rightness. I touched the petals and whispered, "You did good work," and meant it both for him and for me, and for the son who beside me had learned to choose the door of the house where love lives. We clipped a few blooms and placed them near his photograph. "We're still here," I said to the silver frame, and felt the truth of it spark in my chest. Not survival, not even triumph. Something quieter and sturdier continuance. That afternoon, I painted our hands holding thorny stems. The pads of our fingers nicked a bead of blood on his thumb, a thin scratch on the back of mine. I made the background sea green and the shadows long. I titled it Work. When it dried, I hung it beside B's charcoal. On the opposite wall, the deed hung in its simple frame. Paper and picture and portrait. Proofs. We didn't have to point to them to prove a thing. They were there to remind us on days when weather or memory pulled us toward thinner stories. The house creaked in a familiar way as the day cooled, as if settling deeper into the earth and saying, "I am home." I believed it. I believe it now, not long after a young couple stopped by a woman 8 months pregnant and a man with paint on his elbow. They had heard about the garden from Mrs. Potter and wanted to know how to start right. I laughed and told them there is no right, only again. We walked the beds, and I showed them how we had amended the soil, and I told them about the year we killed almost everything by loving too much with the hose. Liam knelt and showed them how to plant a bare root rose without smothering it. The man took notes while the woman pressed her palm to her belly as if the baby were asking for a better angle. On the way out, the woman turned to me. "What do you do when someone you love hurts you and then wants to come back?" she asked suddenly, as if the question had been waiting all along. I thought of easy phrases people like to use: forgive and forget, time heals all wounds, and I let them pass, uninvited. "You make a small job together," I said, "something that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. You see if they show up on time and bring the right tools, and listen when you say the brace needs to be longer. You don't hand them the house. You hand them a hammer." She nodded, eyes bright. The man squeezed her hand. They left with a rose-cutting paper wrapped and thorny, the only honest kind. That night, when the stars did their old work of shining and the air smelled like new leaves, I sat on the porch swing and let the motion hold me. Liam came and sat beside me without speaking. We swung. The chain creaked the way it is supposed to, a music I will never tire of, and the house behind us breathed wood and nail and memory and new paint and laughter and tears and all the words we spoke and all the ones we didn't. I thought of the first morning, the needles of salt and the frost in my veins, and of this one warm as a hand on your back, steadying you before you step. And I understood something I had always known: love is not the absence of betrayal. It is the refusal to let betrayal define the house you live in. We had chosen day by day, board by board, bloom by bloom, a different definition. If you've listened this far, if you've walked the gravel with me and felt the ache and the rise, then you already know the lesson. Paper matters. Boundaries save. Showing up beats promising. And forgiveness, the real kind, wears work gloves and smells like compost. We kept what was ours. We rebuilt what we could. We mourned what we couldn't. And when the roses opened, we didn't declare victory. We poured water. If this story moved you, like to help it reach someone who needs it. Share it with a friend who loves a good comeback. Subscribe for more true stories told from the heart, and comment with the lesson you're taking with you tonight.